It's a time in our service where we collect an offering. For those attending MCC Boston through our social media, you too can participate by going to our website at mccboston.org and clicking on a donate button there for that purpose. Thank you for being a part of our church family. Members and friends of MCC Boston, the message of this church is still so urgently needed in our world today. Just this week alone, a new wave of anti-trans bills have become laws across our nation. In Florida, Law HB 1521 became effective yesterday, making it a crime in that state for anyone to use a restroom or locker room that doesn't align with their sex assigned at birth. It applies to any publicly owned educational buildings, government buildings, correctional facilities, and all school changing facilities. Also in Florida, another new law makes it difficult or impossible for transgender adults to get medical treatment. This law mandates that the adult patients must now sign an informed consent form. It also stipulates that nurse practitioners and virtual visits not be used for any health care relating to transitioning. This is particularly problematic because most of Florida's 100,000 trans residents use these services. If that wasn't bad enough, the new law also makes it legal for doctors and pharmacists to refuse to treat transgender people. These Florida laws now join the other 417 anti-queer bills that have become laws this year alone. Of course, the common denominator of all these discriminatory laws is church-sponsored homophobia and transphobia. Righting injustices against queer people have been the principal focus of our denomination for more than 50 years. For God tells us in Isaiah, the 59th chapter, verse 15, that when we carry out justice, we are agents of divine will. So this week, pray for our trans siblings in Florida, and then think of ways you can participate in the ministries of MCC Boston to help broadcast the message that God loves queer people and desires our full inclusion into society. For now, as the basket is presented, please give as you are able, and may God continue to bless you and MCC Boston. Thank you.
Our scripture reading for the evening is from Genesis 22, verses 1 through 19. After these things, God tested Abraham. God said to him, "Abraham." And he said, "Here I am." He said, "Take your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains that I shall show to you." So Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took 2 of his young men with him, and as well his son Isaac. He cut the wood for the burnt offering and set it out and went to the place in the distance that God had shown him. On the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place far away. Then Abraham said to his young men, "Stay here with the donkey. The boy and I will go over there. We will worship, and then we will come back to you." Abraham took the wood and the burnt offering and laid it on his son Isaac, and he himself carried the fire and the knife. So the 2 of them walked on together. Isaac said to his father, Abraham, "Father." And he said, "Here I am, my son." He said, "The fire and the wood are here, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Abraham said, "God will provide the lamb for a burnt offering, my son." So the 2 of them walked on together. When they came to the place that God had shown him, Abraham had built an altar and laid the wood in order. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then Abraham reached out his hand and took the knife to kill his son. But the angel of God called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, Here I am. He said, Do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him. For now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. And Abraham looked up and saw a ram caught in the thicket by its horns. Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called that place, God will provide. And as it said to this day, on the mount of God it shall be provided. The angel of God called to Abraham a second time from the heaven and said, By myself I have sworn, says God, because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son. I will indeed bless you, and I will make your offspring as numerous as the stars of the heavens and as the sand that is on the seashore. And your offspring shall possess the gate of their enemies. And by your offspring shall all the nations of the earth gain blessing for themselves, because you have obeyed my voice. So Abraham returned to his young men, and they arose and went together to Beersheba. And Abraham lived at Beersheba.
I have always wanted to preach on Abraham and Isaac. Biblical stories hardly get more impactful than this one. Abraham's obedience to God and his devotion, they are so steadfast and so silently resigned in the face of what we know must be all too difficult a request from the God who loves him. Abraham, after all, is asked to kill his own son. Abraham, who prayed well into old age for a son and heir. Abraham, whose son Isaac came as a bona fide God-given miracle. Abraham, who just lost another son, Ishmael, to his own weakness and his wife's fear and cruelty. Abraham, to whom having a son means so much, is asked to sacrifice that exact thing that he treasures most in the world. This is too great a burden to ask anyone to bear, let alone Abraham, to whom having a son held special significance. But bear it he does, with a staggering degree of dignified resignation in the face of a request that violates everything we believe about the natural order of families in the world. And the story is particularly powerful precisely because Abraham's response to the request is so subdued. Other than some instructions given to the two young lads who come along with him, Abraham has not a single line of dialogue in this entire story other than, "Here I am, and God will provide." But we know without him saying it the depths to which this shakes his soul, because how could it not? How could he face anything so terrible as what his God has asked him to do? To lose the only son he has left by his own hand. To undo the grand lineage he sought for decades and has been promised, to betray the trust of his beloved son in one brutal moment of violence, to face returning home to his wife and explaining that he has destroyed the thing they both loved most. The most impactful aspect of this exceptionally crafted story is just Abraham's poker face. In fact, one of the most interesting observations I learned from reading up on this story is the one slight indication of Abraham's feelings. And Abraham took the wood for the offering and put it on Isaac, his son. And he took in hand the fire and the cleaver, and the two of them went together. I myself would never have paid close enough attention to detail to notice that Abraham carried the two dangerous elements, the fire and the knife, while leaving Isaac to safely carry the wood. That is to say, even while on his way to enact the death of his son, while he doesn't grumble, his protective paternal instincts tell him that we must not risk any harm coming to Isaac. He will shoulder the things that could harm the one who bears them. Isaac will shoulder the wood. Even though he fully believes that Isaac's death is imminent by his own hand. Besides this, though, Abraham hardly even registers the fact that the request being made of him is barbaric and cruel and altogether too much to ask of anyone. It's effective because we know just how much his head is spinning, not by his own words or deeds, but by virtue of the simple fact that how could it not be? And that's another thing about this story, I think, in part. I'm so excited to preach on this precisely because it is bonkers. I'm not saying one can't find stories in the Bible even more depraved than this one, but this is certainly the most well-known story that also features such a heartless God. And something about me loves to find the problem in the stories we all love and search for the redeeming factor in the stories that are abhorrent to us. And make no mistake, this story should be abhorrent to us. For God to ask her follower to murder for her is terrible. For God to ask her follower to murder a child is horrific. But for God to ask her father to murder his own child, I mean, what the hell? This is precisely the kind of story that non-religious people would be completely justified in citing to denigrate faith. How can we stand up for a faith that asks a father to kill his son? How on earth can we defend that in good conscience? How could any just and loving God demand that of her followers? And how can we then stand up and say we are followers of that God without shame? But this is also one of those moments in biblical literature where cultural context is key. Because religious human sacrifice in this time and place was practiced and known. The Canaanites were said to have practiced it. The Moabites are shown in 2 Kings to practice it. The Phoenicians and Carthaginians, according to Roman literature, practiced infant sacrifice. The Egyptians sealed living humans in tombs alongside the pharaohs. This was an existing practice known to the writer of this text. And while several sources I've read on this have noted that one should not read this story as a polemic against human sacrifice, one can't really deny that this is a text about human sacrifice in a time and place where human sacrifice was an established tradition in numerous societies. In our context, this passage is horrifying purely because it features a God who asks a man to slaughter his own son. In the context in which it was written, though, that isn't the surprising part. Lots of gods in that time asked their followers to slaughter, sometimes their own children. To those reading or hearing at the time, the surprising part of the story is not that God would require sacrifice. The surprising part is that God would relent. This is part of the heart of the story. It reads to us as a justification for a barbarous practice, but in context, it was a movement away from that exact practice. It was a firm declaration that the God of Abraham and Isaac would not demand the lives of sons and daughters as other deities had done. It was a vindication of the idea that God treasures us and wants us to live, all of us. And how lucky we are to have a God that treasures our lives and wants us to live them fully. It was never guaranteed. That time and place was filled with stories of gods of power and might, who demanded that some among a society must die in order for that society to continue functioning, in order to fertilize the ground for the crops. Many in that time and place believed that gods were to be placated, that their wrath must be averted. So whatever barbarous act was committed was better than the alternative, better than widespread starvation and drought or flood or locusts, any number of nasty divine punishments, really. And I am thankful that we believe in a God who does not ask that of us, who asks us to honor her by living and living more fully. And I also know that y'all know that I'm not going to let us off the hook that easy. Because the other thing is that, yes, ritual human sacrifice was truly horrific when practiced. And yet I stand before you today and tell you that we, in our time and place, have absolutely no right to criticize the cultures that practice this. Human sacrifice is a terrible thing, an atrocity that our very beings cry out against. And yet, if you truly believe in a God who would drown your entire society if you fail to sacrifice one or two people, The case could be made that that decision is ethical. It's basically a trolley problem. And I myself have no qualms telling you, pull the lever, divert the trolley to the one person for the sake of the other 5. I don't care if the one person is rich. I don't care if the one person is a close friend. I don't care if the one person bought you a really great set of cowboy boots. Pull the lever, divert the trolley. If these are really our only 2 options, sacrifice this guy to God so that the rest of us may live in peace and prosperity. Hell, sacrifice me if you have to. Just don't bring disaster on all our heads. It's a terrible position to find oneself in, but it could be considered the ethical choice if you sincerely believed that the one sacrifice was the only way to avert widespread disaster that would finish off your entire society. But we too live in a society that demands that certain people be sacrificed. We're just less honest about it. We live on land that was obtained through the sacrifice of millions of lives of indigenous people. Whole tribes and ways of life obliterated, only a scattered remnant remaining. We live in a country that prospered through the sacrifice of millions of African people kidnapped from their homes. Their descendants still facing exploitation, discrimination, and sneering remarks in the face of the slightest suggestion that we might consider leveling the playing field to mitigate the damage of centuries of enslavement, lynchings, redlining, and Jim Crow. And we live in a society that depends on cheap labor performed by those few migrants who survived crossing the desert or the ocean, whom we still refuse to pay fairly and grant human rights, whose own societies we manipulate to our advantage and then scoff when the inhabitants of those societies travel here under duress, seeking to share a small measure of the prosperity we stole from their land by working menial jobs that we are hiring them to do and then complaining about their presence here. We live in a society that depends on labor performed by our own citizens imprisoned by a justice system that we know to be unjust. We live in a society that depends on a labor class working itself to exhaustion and death, who exist only to have labor and wealth extracted from them, and we do not even care enough for those laborers to provide medical care to them so that they may continue working. We just figure that another poor person will take their place. We live in a society that seeks to deprive of wholeness anyone who questions the rigid lines we've drawn around sexuality and gender, and who will treat us as monsters purely for seeking to live openly. We live in a society that will not relent from keeping the young in burdensome debt obtained through predatory means, and in which our newspapers without blinking suggest death as one of the limited ways to escape that debt. We live in a society that operates with a permanent underclass, deprived of even basic shelter, who suffer only to be used as a threat against the rest of us about what happens to those who won't sell our bodies and our time. Our bodies and our time may be the 2 God-given things and irreplaceable things we can even be said to possess in the first place. All those people are no less dead and no less suffering than those sacrificed for religious rituals. We are no more noble for killing them more slowly by maintaining the machinery that slowly drains the life from them. We are not superior because we sacrifice not for the good of the common folk, but for the black hole of our own greed. Many people in ancient Near Eastern societies, and indeed in many other societies, have practiced human sacrifice because they sincerely believed that their society would perish painfully if they did not follow through. We too live in a society that depends on the death and suffering of others, and what do we even get from it? What is it even for? For them, the sacrifice was necessary to keep their society running correctly, but for us, the sacrifice is what it looks like when society is running correctly. There's a phrase that really bugs me that often comes up during our bi-monthly post-mass shooting national conversation, since we're on the subject of killing our children. Every time we end up repeating this same awful national debate, I see a lot of well-meaning folks saying, those people love their guns more than their children. And no, they don't. I don't think most pro-gun advocates love their guns more than their children. I think they love their guns more than your children. I think they don't really consider that their children might be the ones harmed. I think they look around and see other people's children dying, and they think that's an acceptable price to pay. And what Abraham was prepared to do was horrible. But at least he only would have brought misery on his own house. He didn't skip lightly along, knowing that it would be strangers who suffer. We sacrifice so willingly because we know it is others who will suffer, while Abraham sacrificed believing that it would be his heartbreaking, but having faith that there was good reason for it. We sacrifice each other precisely because we are so unwilling to sacrifice our own comfort. Some ancient Near Eastern societies sacrificed a few citizens for the good of the whole, or so they believed at least, but we don't even do that. We sacrifice each other to our own apathy and materialism and convenience. We sacrifice each other so that we can gain more, or so that no one can take our tools of violence away from us. We sacrifice each other so that we don't have to worry about the well-being of our neighbors, so we can go on our merry way and forget that there may be people out there who need help. We sacrifice each other so that we can pay slightly less at Walmart and McDonald's. We don't do so consciously. That's why it's so important that we don't sacrifice through direct violence, but merely allowing that violence to happen. And I know for many of us, we do it because we feel overwhelmed. We do it because we don't know where to begin to help. We do it because we fear the tidal wave of need will consume us if we take the first step into the water. I'm not saying we're all bad people. If we were, we wouldn't need to hide from ourselves the sacrifices that we make. But we have no right to stand on this ground we live on and judge inhabitants of past societies for acts of violence against one another, because we've got quite the plank in our own eye. So in the end, though this is a truly horrible story, I think Abraham stands above the rest of us. He was prepared to sacrifice his own son, which is an awful thing to think about, but he was prepared to do so because he trusted his God so much. The God who had already come through for him in wondrous ways. He trusted that that God knows what's best, and his faith and obedience were rewarded. In the end, it was just a test of his resolve. Now, I think there were two reasons for this test that Abraham went through. The first is so that God would know that Abraham was committed. God herself says so in the text. For now I know that you fear God and have not held back your son, your only one, from me. We know from Jeremiah that if the one God calls will not follow through, God will not hesitate to call another. And it appears as though this was one case in which God tested and was satisfied with the result. The other reason is so that Abraham would know. So he would know that his faith was strong, that he had a degree of trust in God that would not waver, even when faced with the weightiest demand he could possibly fathom, so that he could move forward stronger for knowing his own strength and resolve. For us, it may well be that we're being tested, or it may not. But either way, the blood we have sown is crying out, and I think there are only two possibilities here. I like to hope that we'll come through eventually. I try to keep hope. And my hope is that we will discover that maybe we do have some of the same strength of faith as Abraham. Maybe we'll find something in ourselves strong enough to stand up against the willing sacrifice of our fellow humans that continues day to day. Maybe we'll learn that we're better than that, and maybe we'll do great things once we know it. Maybe, just maybe, we too will find the strength in ourselves to relent from sacrifice after all this time. It's possible. The results of Abraham's test were never guaranteed. He didn't know whether he could do it either. He didn't realize the strength of faith he possessed, and maybe we don't yet know our own strength either. But if not, if we can't find the strength of will in ourselves to undo all the violence we've wrought, to rip it up by the root so it must finally release its grip on us, if we can't learn to hear the voice inside ourselves that says, "Stop, do not reach out your hand, do no harm," then the good news is that God does not need us to fulfill her purposes. God will accomplish what God means to accomplish, whether it is through this nation and this society or through another. I am not here to preach divine punishment because we have clearly demonstrated that it would be redundant. What I'm afraid of is that if we can't find it in ourselves to drop the knife, then God will move on to another, and we will be left to slowly destroy ourselves, perpetually sacrificing one another until there is none left.